Okay, let's look at Standard 5, Substandard C. Explain. Explain the key features of the Constitution. That's what we need to do. But it says here specifically the Great Compromise. That's one thing we need to look at. Separation of powers, the influence of Montesquieu. We've talked about that already. We're going to talk about it again. Limited government, and the issue of slavery. Let's talk about the Great Compromise first. And we're going to see the theme of compromise. So we're going to look at these key features of the United States Constitution, and in this first part we're going to look at the Great Compromise. What is it? Okay. If there's a compromise, then something was settled. There's an argument. Essentially what we're going to talk about is the creation of the United States Congress. This idea that we have a U.S. Senate today and a U.S. House of Representatives today. A bicameral legislature in the United States today. We have a bicameral legislature. Bicameral means two houses or two chambers, and in the northern chamber we have the U.S. Senate, and then the opposite is the U.S. House of Representatives. This is a Capitol building here. The Great Compromise is going to create our current Congress, our bicameral legislature that makes laws in the United States. And we see this when we look at the two different bodies that are within our legislature. The United States Senate, this chamber here, and then the House of Representatives, this chamber here. So there was a big argument at the Constitutional Convention, and one of the most heated was at the convention was this issue of state representation in this new national legislature of the national part of government that's going to make the law. How would each state be represented in that legislature? So the essential question is, how would each state be represented in the legislative branch of the new government that was going to be created under the Constitution? And to answer that, let's look back first at the Articles of Confederation. How was it before? Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no bicameral government. It was a unicameral. And to see the difference between those, if you look at, roots of the word, you see, or prefixes of the word, cameral means chamber or house, right? So we have this prefix bi means two, and uni means one. And if we use an example of a bicycle, a unicameral bicycle has only one wheel. Uni, one. Bicameral, by two wheels. See? So we use those prefixes to determine. So this is a one house, or two house, and the unicameral is a one house. So under the Articles of Confederation, we had a unicameral or one house legislature called the Confederation Congress. And that lasted from 1781 to 1789. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had a unicameral legislature. That what we're going to create this new is a bicameral legislature like we have today in the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives. This is what the Great Compromise is going to create, this upper thing, bicameral legislature. Alright, so let's look at under the Articles of Confederation what the representation looked like. Each state, regardless of its population, got one vote. So each state was proportional in its vote and how it voted in the legislature under the Articles of Confederation. In other words, the Confederated Congress. Virginia, as large as it was, had one vote. New Jersey, as small as it was, only had one vote. So population really didn't matter. So larger states thought this was unfair. So at the Constitutional Convention, when they're talking about a legislature and proportion of representation for each state in this new legislature, two plans are going to emerge, and there's going to be an argument. The first plan is called the Virginia Plan. In the Virginia Plan, submitted by Edmund Randolph of Virginia and James Madison of Virginia, there's going to be a two-house or bicameral legislature based on each state's population. So we're going to have this two-house legislature, and both are going to be based on population. In other words, it'll look like this. So under the Virginia Plan, Virginia would be based on population. If it had more people, it would have more representatives. New Jersey, if it had lesser people, it would have lesser representatives because it would be based on population. Now the problem with the Virginia Plan is, you can see this, smaller states are not going to like it. They're going to say, This is not fair. Small states, because the large states are going to rule our government. They're going to make all our laws. They're going to have most of the governmental power, or as far as lawmaking power. So smaller states are used to having it their way, like they did under the Articles of Confederation. That's exactly the way they're going to want to keep it. So the state of New Jersey and other smaller plans come up with the New Jersey plan. They want a unicameral legislature like they had under the Articles of Confederation, and then they want each state to have one representative. Be equal representation for every state regardless of population. So the New Jersey plan would look like this. It's basically the exact same thing as under the Articles of Confederation. The problem with the New Jersey plan is that Virginia didn't like it. The larger states didn't like it. They thought it was unfair, and they thought that it gave disproportionate amount of governing power, lawmaking power, to the smaller states. And they thought that if they had a lot of people in their states, they would be misrepresented if a smaller state with fewer people had greater representation than their people. So they believe that large states have more people that should receive equal representation. Each person should have equal representation. And under the New Jersey plan, large states said that wouldn't happen. So the comparison here between the two, if we look at them like this, okay, Virginia wants a bicameral two-house legislature. New Jersey wants a unicameral or one-house legislature. When we determine how each state is represented, New Jersey says we want every state to have one vote. Well, Virginia says, well, I think votes from each state ought to be based on the population of their particular state. Okay. So we see we have an argument here, and everybody's looking out for themselves, and in comes this great compromise. And this compromise is going to settle this argument. And the Great Compromise, it's actually called the Connecticut Plan. A delegation from Connecticut come in and said, here's a solution. We call it the Great Compromise. It's going to resolve this conflict between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and it's because it's going to create a bicameral legislature or a two-house legislature. And they're going to do it in the upper house. They're going to say, let's base that on equal proportion, and let's make the small states happy. And then in the lower house, call it the House of Representatives, and let's base it on population, make the larger states happy. So it's going to look like this. It's going to take a piece of the Virginia plan and put it here, and it's going to take pieces of the New Jersey plan and put it here. Okay, so when we look at Connecticut, it says, okay, you know what, let's have a bicameral legislature. So we take that from Virginia and put it here. And then what we'll do is, to satisfy both sides of this argument, let's make the upper house be the Senate and say 2 votes per state. That way we'll satisfy these smaller states, New Jersey, and make sure they feel like they're represented. Okay. And then we'll create the lower house, and let's base it on population. Okay. And we'll take that from the Virginia plan over here and add it here. Now, when a bill becomes a law, it has to pass through both the upper and the lower house. That way, small states are represented here in the Senate, and then larger states are represented here in the lower house. And so that settled this conflict between large states and small states and made sure that they were equally represented and happy. So when the Great Compromise created the United States Congress, this bicameral legislature, New Jersey was like, wonderful, yay, because every state had an equal proportion of votes. Two senators from each state is what we get now. So this is going to satisfy the small states. And then the House of Representatives is going to be based on population. And then that population will be counted every 10 years through what we call a census. And this is going to satisfy the larger states. They're going to be happy. Okay. Alright, let's look at the second part of this. Explain the key features of the U.S. Constitution. Let's look at separation of powers, influence of Montesquieu, and then limited government. And we're going to look at it as, what is limited government? Okay. And let's look back. Under the King and Parliament, they felt that they were too tyrannical, too abusive, and some of the founding fathers and leaders felt that the reason was because governing power was in one place, and that was the problem. If you put governing power in one place, it's going to be abused. Okay, so they created federalism to try to split that power up, And under federalism, they're going to create a national level of government and then a state level of government. And state's going to have its own powers, and national government's going to have its own powers. We're talking about dual federalism here for AP guys. But anyway, they're going to share certain powers too, and you're going to go more into this when you talk about this in civics. But in other words, they're going to take this power here and they're going to turn it into this. Okay, under the Constitution, the only two levels of government is the national and the state level. Those are the only two that are protected. Now the state can divvy up a little bit more power and delegate some state powers to local governments, but I want to show you how power is going to be distributed and limited. It's going to be chopped up here in different levels, two different levels, then the state's going to chop its power up further into a local level. So we're talking about limited government. How do we limit government? We limit its power. That's how we do it. So under federalism, we kind of limited by creating two different governments and said that we protected them from one another. Neither one can destroy the other. Then separation of powers comes about because of Montesquieu. This guy, Baron de Montesquieu, wrote a pamphlet called Spirit of the Laws, and he says, hey, you know what? All powers of government in one place, bad idea. Bad idea. That's what happened with King George III in Parliament. Not good. Not good. This unitary system, not good. A better idea is to separate the branches into three different powers: legislative, executive, and judicial. And that's what Montesquieu came up with. So as we created the Constitution, our founding father says we need a separation of powers and checks and balances. So essentially what we're going to do because of this is we're going to split it up even further. You know, we had the national here, state here. Now we're going to split it up even further, and we're going to create a legislative that makes the laws, executive that enforces the laws, and a judicial that interprets what the law is. So what we did with here creating the limited government is we split power up so no one area could have the same amount of power. So we're redistributing power from one location to several. And in separation of powers, we get this. You know, they pass the laws in the legislature or in Congress that were created in the Great Compromise, or the executive branch, the president carries out or executes the laws, enforces the law, and then the judicial branch interprets the law. So that's separation of powers. Down here we talk about checks and balances. What can they do? And another one would be this. You know, the president or Congress, the legislative branch, can make a law, and the president can veto that law, and then the legislative branch can then override the veto. But it is the court can determine a law unconstitutional. So they're going to volley and fight for power with their checks and balances. And in those things, we're going to create this limited government. So that's what we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about separation of powers, influence, Montesquieu, and limited government. That's how we limit our government. We went from this to this. And under federalism, it's limited because the national government can declare war. The states cannot declare war. Marriage license, marriage laws, public safety is going to be something that's going to be probably both of them. Licenses, professional licenses, like on guns, state has that power only. A national government cannot control that. You know, coining money is something a national government can do that state can't. So in this respect, we limit our government. Alright, so let's look at the next part. Alright, we got Great Compromise, we got separation of powers, we got limited government. Now the issue of slavery. A question come up: would slaves be counted when we did our census to determine a state's representation in this new Congress, this new legislature for the United States government? Could we count slaves into the population when we did the census to determine each state's representation? It's going to be a big argument over this. Okay, would slaves be counted into the census that happens every 10 years? There's eventually going to be this compromise called the 3/5 compromise. This is extremely important for you to know. 3/5 compromise means that they agreed that you know, you can look at it just two different ways. Some people look at it and criticize it, saying that a slave is not a whole person. You know, only 3/5 of a person that's a slave would be counted into the population, whereas a free person, all of them would. Or you can look at it this way. Free people, each individual will be counted as one. But in slave population, you would count it, but you would only count 3 slaves out of 5 that you had. So the last 2 you would not count, but 3 out of 5 slaves would be counted. 3/5 compromise. Alright, so back to the slavery issue, really come out of 2 different arguments. And northern states are going to disagree with southern states at the Constitutional Convention. First question is, could we count slaves into the population? Northern slaves said absolutely not. You know, some of the representatives from North said, can I count my chickens and my cows and horses and goats? Because they're property too. You say slaves are property, can I count all my livestock? And just as a rhetorical question to ask them to kind of get them to realize you can't count property into the census. But they had to compromise because another question was asked, who is going to control the slave trade under the Constitution? Will it be the national government or the state government? And see, we see the arguments. The northern states, no, we're not going to count slaves into the census to determine population representation of states in the new legislature Congress. And they say that the national government will control the slave trade. Well, southern states, where a lot of the slavery was, said, you know, we should count slaves into the population, but when it comes to the slave trade, only the state should be allowed to do that. So in making the compromise, the northern states and southern states come up with, we will count 3 out of every 5 slaves, or 3/5. And then on the slave trade part, it says the national government would, but not for 20 years, the southern states. So that was a compromise. Each side gave up something in the compromise. Somebody lost something, somebody gained something. Alright, so what end result was with the counting of slaves at 3/5 compromise, which is extremely important, 3 out of 5s would be counted. Under the slave trade compromise was where the national government would control the slave trade, but not for 20 years. Okay, so have we met our objective? Have we met the objective of the standard? Do we explain the key features of the Constitution, the Great Compromise, the separation of powers, influence of Montesquieu, limited government, issue of slavery? I think we have. Watch back over the video. I hope this helps you on the test. Okay, let's look at Standard 5, Substandard C. Explain the key features of the Constitution. That's what we need to do. But it says here specifically the Great Compromise. That's one thing we need to look at. Separation of powers, the influence of Montesquieu. We've talked about that already. We're going to talk about it again. Limited government, and the issue of slavery. Let's talk about the Great Compromise first, and we're going to see the theme of compromise. So we're going to look at these key features of the United States Constitution, and in this first part we're going to look at the Great Compromise. What is it? Bicameral bicycle has only one wheel. Uni, one. Bicameral, by 2 wheels. See? So we use those prefixes to determine. So this is a 2 house, and the unicameral is a 1 house. So under the Articles of Confederation, we had a unicameral or 1 house legislature called the Confederation Congress. And that lasted from 1781 to 1789. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had a unicameral legislature. That what we're going to create this new is a bicameral legislature like we have today in the United States Senate that makes laws in the United States. And we see this when we look at the 2 different bodies that are within our legislature. The United States Senate, this chamber here, and then the House of Representatives, this chamber here. So there was a big argument at the Constitutional Convention, and one of the most heated at the convention was this issue of state representation in this new national legislature of the national part of government that's going to make the law. How would each state be represented in that legislature? So the essential question is, how would each state be represented in the legislative branch of the new government that was okay? If there's a compromise, then something was settled. There was an argument. Essentially what we're going to talk about is the creation of the United States Congress. This idea that we have a U.S. Senate today in the U.S. House of Representatives today, a bicameral legislature in the United States today. We have a bicameral legislature. Bicameral means two houses or two chambers, and in the northern chamber we have the U.S. Senate, and then the opposite is the U.S. House of Representatives. This is a Capitol building here. The Great Compromise is going to create our current Congress. Our bicameral legislature is going to be created under the Constitution. And to answer that, let's look back first at the Articles of Confederation. How was it before? Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no bicameral government. It was a unicameral. And to see the difference between those, if you look at, roots of the word, you see, or prefixes of the word, cameral means chamber or house, right? So we have this prefix bi means two, and uni means one. And if we use an example of a bicycle, a uni